Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this Saturday morning for our first virtual conference with the North Carolina Maritime History Council. My name is Nathan Richards. I'm going to be your host for the first session. To begin with, I'd like to introduce the North Carolina Maritime History Council and what we do. The NCMHC was incorporated in 1990 with the mission to identify and encourage historical and educational projects that promote, enhance, or preserve the state's maritime history and culture. We provide support for a variety of projects and programs to help encourage advancement and awareness of maritime history in the Carolinas. For some examples of our work, these include this annual conference, as well as the management of a historic vessel registry for North Carolina, and an annual publication called Tributaries, which highlights maritime research throughout the Carolinas. By becoming a member, you help support North Carolina's maritime heritage, and we thank you all for joining us here today. Today, we have a panel on ships and shipwrecks of the Carolinas, where we'll be talking with our presenters on themes related to their research. Here is the format to give you an idea of what to expect. First, we're going to take a few moments for each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their background. After I've concluded my remarks, I'm going to ask Dr. Harris, then Jim Spirek, then Patrick Boyle, and then Josh Vestal to introduce themselves. After that, we'll kick off the conversation with a list of questions to help guide our discussion. For anyone in the virtual conference, please feel free to post questions in the chat as the panelists talk about their research. I will be also asking for additional comments or questions as we move through our discussion. Really, my hope is that you ask the questions and that I don't have to go to my list. So while I have some questions prepared, I'd love to give priority to your questions. While we're in this session, if you could please keep your microphone off until asked to ask your question, this would be much appreciated. A final note is that this is being recorded and the Q&A session is intended to be uploaded to the YouTube channel for viewing later. So with that, could we please introduce the session participants? Dr. Harris.
Hey, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am a faculty member in the Maritime Studies program at ECU. I also am honored to be the new chair of the Maritime History Council. My research is both maritime history and underwater archaeology. Throughout my career, I've been very interested and engaged with a combination of African maritime history and African-American maritime history, Caribbean, Atlantic world, and also looking at interdisciplinary approaches to the topics. So I'm delighted to be here today and also excited for our first virtual conference in North Carolina.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is James Spirek. I'm the state underwater archaeologist of South Carolina, so the other Carolina and the original Carolina, I believe. And so I work at the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. And I've been there since 1996 and back in 2012 assumed the role of the state underwater archaeologist position. Our job, of course, is to protect and conduct research of the underwater archaeological legacy in the lakes, rivers, and coastal waters of South Carolina. And most of our work, at least what I've been focused in on, has been a lot of the Civil War naval operations throughout the South Carolina borders. And then also, as noted in the talk, also when I was at East Carolina University as a graduate student, worked on the Southfield, another Civil War gunboat that had a connection between the two states after all. So and again, glad to participate in the conference.
Hi everyone, I'm Patrick. Thank you for having me. I'm one of the students at ECU and I'm researching the historic fisheries of the Tar-Pamlico River, specifically the Oyster fishery. I'll also be looking at the vessels used in that fishery, specifically the vessels used from the Chesapeake Bay region and the influence they had on the North Carolina watercraft. But yeah, thanks for having me here.
Yeah, I'm Josh Vestal. I'm also a graduate student at ECU, and actually just defended my thesis, which is what this talk is on. So definitely like interested in kind of World War II history and 3D modeling and how that can kind of impact cultural heritage and stuff moving forward. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again for producing such great videos. So, you know, it's the start of that channel for us, and hopefully it inspires a lot of people to keep researching maritime history in North and South Carolina. I'm going to ask Patrick a first question. My first question is, and if again, to remind everyone, feel free to throw a question into the chat. I'd love to preference your questions over mine. Let me find my question. Okay, so in 1891, this is a test of someone who's writing their research, so it's okay to not know the question, know the answer, Patrick. In 1891, North Carolina was supposedly in an oyster war that saw potentially hundreds of oystering vessels from Maryland, Virginia in North Carolina waters. From the little I've read, these vessels are referred to as dredges. So I'm wondering, from your talk, if you think your vessel is a dredge, or whether you think that this is a term that just applies to any vessel that was cultivating oysters, or whether you think that there's specific vessel traits of what constitutes an oyster dredge.
That is an interesting question, and I've heard them referred to as dredgers before, and I always took that as just it's one of the ships designed specifically to actually use their like sail power to use a dredge. But yeah, as far as I know, I think that's the only reason, but I'm not positive.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in?
I was going to ask if, I know up in the Chesapeake, it seems that the oystermen there do the tonging. Did North Carolina folks tong as well?
Yes, they actually tonged exclusively until the Chesapeake Bay oysterers came down and really just started dredging. And they kind of adapted the equipment themselves.
There's a question for Josh. Chelsea, feel free to ask your question.
Oh, sure. So as we've all been in lockdown and the world has shifted almost exclusively in some areas to a virtual format, do you think that 3D modeling of historic sites and objects will become more or less valuable as a research tool?
Definitely think it's more valuable now because it kind of implements the ability to not have to be there physically and to see stuff like that. But I think in general, like 3D modeling and 3D photography, photogrammetry and stuff like that are going to be a huge part, and like already have been a huge part of kind of like cultural heritage and archaeology moving forward. And that's just kind of more impacted by like the COVID and quarantining and stuff like that. But I definitely think it's a very valuable tool to like the public in general, and being able to show kind of what we're doing and how that impacts us and them and the heritage itself.
I'll ask a follow-up to that question. Josh, I was wondering if you could elaborate on what the main challenges are for preserving battleships in the way that the USS North Carolina Memorial has been the intention to preserve it. And I'm also wondering whether you think the 3D modeling helps ameliorate those challenges or helps solve could solve certain problems in the future.
So I guess I kind of talk about it in the thesis, but some of the major kind of issues that you deal with ship museums is the way that the manner in which they're berthed, whether they're floating or embedded in the ground. So like with the North Carolina, it's embedded in the ground, and that actually does help protect kind of the portion of the ship that's in the mud because it's an anaerobic environment. And then you have the wind water line of the ship is really the highest risk of corrosion on the vessel. What was the last part of your question? I'm sorry.
Oh, so sort of, I know that the first question I asked was one I asked you in your thesis defense, but
Right.
I guess I'm extending it to saying if there are certain challenges faced by battleship memorials,
Mhm.
do you think that, and I know that you had only a certain way of, you're using modeling for one particular purpose, right? To sort of
Right.
show areas of risk,
Mhm.
but do you think that the 3D modeling could help other challenges, you know, in managing a tourist
Right.
asset in a heritage site like the North
Yeah.
Carolina?
Yeah, so kind of like you were saying, I used it to show areas of risk, and that was more for kind of like maintenance schedules and knowing kind of where, if you know where your areas of risk are, you can plan to ameliorate those risks and reduce those. Outside of that, I mean, it's more, I guess, I think that right now the purpose that I use it for helps with planning, but not as much with, I don't know, other areas of managing the ship, I guess.
Josh, does the Battleship North Carolina have a management plan? And if so, would you consider it proactive or sort of reactive or just a combination of both?
I would say initially so from 1960 until almost 2011, I would say it was very much reactive. They had the portable cofferdam project in 2011 where they had to repair a portion of the starboard bow's hull. And they used kind of a portable cofferdam to do that, which was just kind of, like I said, reacting to it. I think installing the permanent cofferdam has allowed them to be more proactive because now they're able to control the wind water line. They're able to remove the water and access areas of the ship that they couldn't initially without dredging it and towing it to a dry dock or something. So outside of being able to get to the area that's under the mud, they've now established a method for them to access areas of the ship that they might need to maintain better.
Can they control the water depth, or is it just sort of like a wet cofferdam?
So they can pump the water out and then let it back in. I think there's like weir gates at the bow and the stern of the ship to let water in, and then they've got pumps to pump it out as well. I think currently they pumped it dry outside of like the mud, and they're replacing the port bow right now. I think there's some images of that on like Facebook and stuff.
Yeah. So it sounds like they've also added another maintenance cost on the cofferdam is now another added expense.
Right. Yeah, and I think that the cofferdam was partially funded by grants and stuff, and then, like I said, they're relying pretty much solely on income from tourism as well.
Which I assume is taking a hit now.
Yeah. So that's another, I guess, thing that, like Chelsea was asking, being able to implement kind of 3D modeling and other sorts of like virtual, whether that's video tours and stuff like that, are good ways to kind of make up for that lack of physical interaction.
I'm going to ask Jim a question. It was really great. I think that your presentation was really great at exemplifying the theme of this conference, but it was also really interesting because of the personal information that you found out in relation to the Ordnance. So it was probably a bit of a coincidence that in the end, but when Dr. Babbitts first suggested the link between the Dahlgren and the Southfield, what did you think? Did you think it was really plausible? And how surprised were you to find that personal link to your own sort of graduate research?
Well, the cannon, when it was underwater, we were able to get some, like I said, saw some of the markings. And when Lynn was there and all the ECU bunch was there, we did a rubbing of that top hammerlock insert there, and it came out as 578. So even when you rubbed it, it didn't come out as 513. So we always knew that number was there. And then we had the opportunity when we were at the National Archives to we were doing other research, but said we got to find out if this is the Southfield gun. So we still knew it as 578, and that's when Larry wrote the article. I think Lynn co-authored as well. It was still 578. So we looked for that number first, and that gun was supposedly aboard the USS Cincinnati, which was out west. But when you looked at the last firing date was 1865, so it certainly couldn't have been that cannon. And when I looked a little bit of the history of the USS Cincinnati, I know Ed Barris, rest in peace. He said that the Cairo was the hard luck ironclad out there, but if there ever was one, I think it's the Cincinnati. It sank 3 times, and they raised it up 3 times. But so that was the potential as one of those cannons. So when we saw that 578, I said, "There's no way that that's obviously our cannon." So we still, like I said, we still knew it as 578. And I said, well, we got to look at the Southfield guns. Let's look for Southfield guns. And so we looked through the register and saw 513 and said, maybe that's it, because it says sunk aboard the Southfield, never recovered. And so when we went then to lift the cannons, we finally got a good look at that insert that said, yes, that was the Southfield. And obviously when Larry posited those as a potential candidate, I was, obviously I went to all my research notes. I still had all my cards from back in the days of cards and all that for your notes, and went through them. And there during the December 10th, 1863, when the Southfield came back from Norfolk and went to Plymouth, the Confederates attacked. And so the gunboat protected the town and fired all its guns, except one. And so the captain wrote down all the serial numbers of the cannons that were fired and how much they fired, but he didn't list 513, because 513 apparently was pointed away from the town and wasn't fired at all. So it wasn't in my notes as well. And so obviously when we did find out that it was connected to the Southfield, that was obviously a nice little personal and professional touch, that to be connected also with the PD after all those years, to find out that was the cannon. And your research, even as a graduate student, comes in handy every now and again, even as you move on.
Yeah, that's great. I worked with Dr. Babbitts on the USS Otsego in 2005, and so I wouldn't say that I know a lot about what was happening in the Roanoke River, but I do recall that the CSS Albemarle was really protecting the Roanoke because it was trying to protect Weldon and trying to protect the rail line access, making sure the Union didn't cut off the rail line there. So I thought it was another great part of your story that you have this notation by the Union that the gun is never recovered, but then you found out that it was recovered, and it probably went to Weldon and then found its way to South Carolina through that rail line. So that's another interesting connection. And I think it's also really great how, the conflicting historical accounts really sort of got solved through your archaeological research. So that was really great.
Well, that was part of, a lot of times folks see cannons and, the kids clamor over them or whatever, but there's really not too much history associated with that cannon. They just sort of got it from somewhere and mounted it in the park or whatever. So that's really another aspect of these cannons, is each of them have a history, and, we know, down to, their use and what they were doing. So I think that makes them another important collection as well.
Yeah, and I guess the other interesting thing that you brought up, as I was watching your video, I was thinking about all these potential topics that students could take up for theses. But you also mentioned in your discussion about the Dahlgren, the Commodore Perry, and which is I guess an analog for the Southfield, right? But it reminded me that the remains of the Commodore Hull, which is very similar to the Commodore Perry, became the Waccamaw, and the Waccamaw is abandoned in Wilmington and sitting right on the waterfront there. And it just reminded me to be a great thesis for a student to look at.
Well, that one, I looked at that a long time ago as well with Richard Lawrence and the guys down there. And Waccamaw actually was the Senor Nuestra del Regla, which
Yep.
was a ferry boat built in New York City by John Inglis, and John Inglis built the Southfield. So obviously I wanted to
Okay.
see how they connected the two, and especially where the rudder met the stern post, which was very similar to what the Southfield was as well. Sort of, I forget the technical term, but the stern or stem post is sort of concaved in to receive the rudder. And so you could see that on the Waccamaw. So that was, another interesting parallel, and Waccamaw would probably be a good thesis topic as well, for sure.
And you could probably throw a stone from the Waccamaw and hit the USS North Carolina. So
well, I did see. I do remember seeing it there, but and like for the like you mentioned, the hull, the Commodore Perry, you saw those sort of gun flaps that are there on the gun log works or the breech works. Not all the gunboats had them. And so when we looked at those pictures way back when, we thought perhaps the Southfield would have them as well, sniper shields to protect the gun crew, but there were none on the Southfield. So they were, you saw those guys just standing there. They were mighty exposed, and you had 3 large guns with all those gun crews on there. It must have been quite an orchestra going on to fire all the guns at the same time. And they could also be put all on the same side as well, which of course then listed your ferry boat that way, but they could do it.
Well, that's a great segue into Jeremy's got a question for you, Jim.
Yeah, so I was going to ask just how common it was for the opposing sides of the Civil War, or what have you, to remove those ordnance from wrecks. And do you see that in other instances in wrecks that you've looked at or within the literature, or is that something special for those particular guns, especially now that you found out from the Dahlgren that they transported it special via railroad and sort of made those special concessions to get that down to Mars Bluff?
Well, that probably could be a research angle to see how many, ships were sunk. Like Larry mentioned, there was the 2 out west. I forget which ones are the 2 out west. But I think it's sort of unique in the fact that, the Union, they retained the Cincinnati, sank twice, and they were able to recover the guns. The Cairo sunk as well, but the Confederates weren't able to salvage that. Actually, the other instance that jumps to mind was the USS Keokuk that sank off of Charleston after the April 7th, 1863 ironclad assault into the harbor. It got riddled like a colander and sank about a few hours afterwards. And Admiral DuPont said, there's no way that the Confederates can get those guns, but they exerted quite a bit of effort, the Confederates did, and actually recovered the 2 11-inch Dahlgrens, and then actually again turned those against the Union forces. And actually you can see one of the Dahlgrens there if you go to Battery Park in Charleston. So there's a captured gun. So I think actually maybe 2 of the instances that I know of are in South Carolina of getting the guns. And as for the Southfield itself, they spent over a couple months trying to recover the whole wreck itself, but apparently didn't have the capacity to do that. So they obviously wanted those cannons. And as I mentioned, those 3 cannons, 3 of the Dahlgrens stayed in Plymouth and were recovered spiked. The 100-pounder Parrott went somewhere else as well. So actually that might be out somewhere as well. And then again, there's another cannon missing. So there's potential for another Southfield cannon out there. Although there's a person, they call him he's called the Register of, or the Keeper of the Register of Known Cannons during the Civil War. So he's got a big old list of every cannon that's known and has a little bit of their history. And he proved useful, just confirming some things with me as well. So a few more cannons, but as the actual recovery of them, it seems that's was pretty rare.
I'll just add that modern Greece is a slightly different example, but because those guns were being transported as cargo, but they were also recovered from the shipwreck just outside Fort Fisher.
Is that at time of sinking they were recovered, Chelsea?
Yeah, just about. Yeah, they had about a month. They thought they could originally refloat the boat, but eventually, there was just too much damage. So that was one of the first things that they pulled off. And those guns sat at Fort Fisher for a little bit to defend that fort. And I think one was taken up maybe to Virginia after that as well.
Jim, did you find anything about the actual logistics of the recovery operation? These things are really heavy, so interested to know if there's a description in any of the logbooks or the salvage operations.
I never did, I sort of didn't pursue that in the thesis at all to find out where those cannons went to. And as the actual, like what's published in the official records, there's, they talk about putting 2 schooners alongside alongside where the Southfield was, and then running cables, which I'm assuming would have been done, by the slaves, I'm assuming, unless they had some good divers. They didn't, I don't think there was any professional divers going on. So they may have just been sort of looping the ropes as best they could, was why they couldn't do it. Now, how they actually got the cannons, again, maybe they had the slaves go down and tie around the cannons. But yeah, I don't have any precise information on how they recovered them individually, but they were able to do all 6 of them. And I don't know if they got the boat howitzer, probably did as well.
Great. I haven't asked Lynn a question yet. So one of the interesting things about your talk was you showed images of the vessels that were engaged in the slave trade and their dimensions and design features. And then you talk about the Scuppernong Canal, the canals being built by Collins and other people coming into Lake Phelps. And then you also talk about the colonial ports of entry. And I guess one question I had for you is, do you think that when Collins and his company was digging the canal, that they had ever intended to bring those vessels engaged in the slave trade directly to his plantation?
There is a little bit of controversy about that, because at that time, 1785, they were bringing in a tax or a due on enslaved cargoes directly from Africa. And so you see in some of the records that there's a discussion about them coming into South Carolina first, and then to North Carolina, which was often the more common voyage route. But it seemed, because of those 2 agents in Edenton that I mentioned in my talk, who were fairly well known. One guy's name was Harry Hill and the other one was Thomas Foote. And they actually went to court to file a petition against bringing in a cargo of enslaved Africans at that exact time the cargo came in. So it seems like that one clue in the literature, in the primary source literature, suggests that these cargoes came in directly to North Carolina. There's, as far as I can tell, the most confirming evidence about the cargoes, the consignments actually being part of the Dickinson and the Pettigrew irrigation project, is that Grinnell, who was one of the captains on those boats, ended up being in the employ of the family, of the Somerset Place families. So, and he appears in the account books and the registers. And so there are a number of different, it was really a piecemeal project of putting these clues together. And then some serendipitous things sort of coming together and confirming what most of the descendants who'd started doing research had already anticipated. So yeah, it's interesting, but challenging.
Fantastic. Well, there's a follow-up question here from Patrick.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about Pirate Dick, who you briefly mentioned, specifically about why he was considered a glamorous pirate and whether or not this was simply just like a nickname given to him by locals, because it seems like it's pretty rare that pirates get to just retire instead of being.
That actually came from his family records through Ancestry.com. And he was, it's part of their genealogy and the family law. about him. And there's a discussion, everything fits the dates, the ships he served on, and he is just described, often he was involved in privateering, and often there was a gray line, an overlap between privateering and pirating. There was no indication in his family records that we could discern that suggested he was involved with the slave trade. But he did, however, own slaves, and clearly he was the captain on that consignment. But that's simply family law that suggests he's a pirate, is his nickname in the legacies he left behind.
Dr. Harris, I was hoping you could actually, that was sort of one of my questions too, is it seems like any in-depth conversation about piracy that looks at primary sources invariably intersects with the slave trade. And I'm wondering whether you have thoughts on why that just seems to be a recurrent association between those activities.
Yeah, well, a lot of times the slave vessels carrying consignments of slaves were the wealthiest cargoes. They were carrying extremely lucrative goods out into the slave trade. They were heavily armed with, not more so than the average ship, because they were protecting their cargo. So these were valuable prizes. So, as we can see with the Queen Anne's Revenge, the La Concorde was an asset. So there's that interchange between, the pirates who are going to target heavily armed, lucrative vessels like slave ships and convert them. The other vulnerable areas were where these vessels, often the slave trade vessels, set down to replenish or resupply en route to the slave trade. So these were, if you did some modeling, you'd probably find a lot of the pirate ships were targeting areas on slave ship routes. So I think that's an interesting connection itself. But privateers, just looking at Grinnell's life again, to go back to that previous question, as well as the Brattle, who was the captain of Jeanette, the other vessel bringing in these consignments, both of them had been in naval, captains during the Revolutionary War. They were very well known. There was correspondence between, for example, Grinnell and Ben Franklin, Jonathan Adams, about various missions at sea, which is interesting. This is glamorous pirate Dick. And then after serving in the wars, what was the default was things like slave trade. And so he was introduced into the slave trade. He was clearly a very well-established captain, commander. He knew the sea routes. He knew, he was introduced by one of the other slave captains, the protege of Aaron Lopez, Nathaniel Briggs, to the slave trade, to the markets, to the ways to negotiate with the traders in Africa and the various company agents. And after that, where do you go? You've been involved in the slave trade. There's a bit of privateering into the mix, and then interestingly, his last consignment was to work for this plantation owner, this wealthy plantation owner, who probably also had those same political connections and liaisons that he did during that latter part of the 1700s after the Revolutionary War. So I think those were all, that's sort of an interesting puzzle to put together.
Right. Well,
Lynn, is there any known slave shipwrecks in North Carolina in the Albemarle Sound area or along the Outer Banks?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, neither of these were wrecked, other than the Queen Anne's Revenge, but that's just, La Concorde, secondary, it wasn't the lifetime of a slave ship. That's an interesting question. Nathan or Jeremy, do you know of any?
Never heard of any.
Yeah.
There might be there might be some that are still yet to be found, or that have had a past life in the slave trade, but research
Actual with the cargo of slaves, no.
Yeah,
No.
nothing's been identified though.
Yeah, I think we have one or two along the South Carolina coastline. But Lynn, so it seemed like Rhode Island figured a lot with the North Carolina. So it was sort of North Carolina a sub area of the Rhode Island slave traders. Is that how it sort of worked?
Right. So the planters would go to Boston regularly. That was one of the trips to set, for example, the Lake Company, the plantation, the Collins family visited Boston, negotiated about ships and captains and cargoes, but the vessels would often come through South Carolina. For example, Grinnell did a lot of cargoes to Charleston before he started working in North Carolina. So there's that connection again between South Carolina and North Carolina. And you see advertisements in newspapers where they note that a vessel would be coming from Rhode Island to Charleston, to North Carolina, then to Bermuda and the West Indies, sometimes to Europe, sometimes not. But you see after the Revolutionary War, they start cutting out the European trip, and it's directly Rhode Island to the southern colonies and then to the West Indies. And the cargoes also change. So with the Grinnell cargo as well as the Battle cargo, it was exclusively rum. It was much more diverse before. They're carrying hides and wood, lumber, but rum seemed to be the item of choice in that time period, at least the 1780s.
Lynn, you mentioned, you used the word lucrative a lot. So, a lot of these men have found something and they're exploiting the lucrative trade in something or something else. But also part of the story is, with the Lake Company and the Collins family's role, the story of Collins buying out his partners implies that out of anyone benefiting in these lucrative trades, he seems to have been more successful than his partners. Have your team looked at the background to Josiah Collins's specific decision-making processes or activities to work out how he was able to leverage that into taking over the entire enterprise?
Yeah, and he did in the end. He bought them all out, and I think all the enslaved people as well, because it seemed by the early 1800s, his number of enslaved people working on that plantation increased to 300, which was, that almost matches up directly with the number of consignments coming in by ships. But I think he was a fairly astute businessman, but he also was very, I think, aggressive in his business dealings, and it seemed really complicated trying to dig that canal through other people's properties. There were lots of argumentative correspondences about taking agricultural land away when they dug that canal, and how they were going to compensate the folks who owned the properties. And I think Mackenzie is she's getting into those records. We wanted to dig in a little deeper, but with the archives being closed, we didn't get as much into the details. But it seemed like everybody was, getting into very shady business transactions. And in fact, he even began to come to loggerheads with Grinnell himself. We can't really find out the details of that, but in one piece of correspondence, he mentions that Grinnell is crazy and he needed to be moved out of the equation of the business world that he was conducting. You know, there definitely seemed to be something going on that we couldn't lay our hands on at the time. So.
Thank you. Patrick has another question for you.
Oh, more of an update. I just wanted to double check before I said anything, but someone had asked if there are any other known pirate shipwrecks within the Sound, and I just recalled reading a historical source that when Blackbeard was retired in Bath, he had illegally brought some goods in, and to avoid it being traced back to him, ordered his crew to go scuttle the ship somewhere. So there could be a potential pirate shipwreck pretty close to Bath, which is pretty interesting.
Well, Patrick, that's a good segue for me to ask you a question, because you mentioned the word scuttle, and I'm wondering. I know that your research is really new. You know, you've only just found and started studying your site, but do you think that you've got hallmarks on your vessel of it being a wrecked vessel, or do you think that it's, you know, it's very close to the Castle Island Ship's Graveyard area? Do you think that it was potentially a scuttled vessel? I'm going to ask you if it's Blackbeard's. It's obviously not.
Yeah. At the moment, we didn't really find anything that really indicated whether it was wrecked or abandoned, but I think it was probably just abandoned after the Oyster canning facility in Washington went under and they didn't really know what to do with the ship. So it's directly across from where that would have been. There was also things on the wreck that should be there if it had wrecked, like pieces of like the dredge and like more of the more expensive mechanical equipment that's just missing. So maybe they just abandoned it, took everything off of it, and just left it there. But right now, yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, I was just curious because, you know, you'd think that leaving your dredge equipment on there, and I thought it was really excellent how you found able to identify stove legs, and it makes me wonder, you know, well, actually, maybe that's the question for you. How did you know that? How did you find that information? And where's the rest of it?
Right. So we pulled a few of those up, and it just had like a really odd shape. It almost looked like an elephant's trunk. And I think we were all just kind of holding it. And I think it was Dr. Raup said that looks like a foot, like something would be holding that up. And there was at least 3 of them. 2 of them were heavily concreted. We photographed the one that was not. And while I went to the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum a few weeks ago to do some preliminary research, and they had multiple stoves, I think they called them cabooses, that they would actually nail into like the galley of the ship so that it wouldn't move around. And the small holes within that foot, like, was where they would nail it through. And they had multiple variations of them, and they looked really similar. So probably a stove foot.
Patrick,
sorry to bust in, but can you tell us a little bit more about what you found when you went to the museum, and how you've sort of found that trip in terms of helping to formulate your research questions, and just some of the artifacts and things you were able to identify. It's kind of a plug for Patrick's thesis, but he found some wonderful things.
Yeah, I was planning on going up to this museum later on this fall or maybe early next spring, but they're actually completely renovating their archive, so I had to make a spontaneous trip up there. I'm glad I did, though. I found a lot of information in their archives, ship's plans, old photographs, but their museum is fantastic. They have one big just building dedicated to oystering in the Chesapeake, and just walking through that and just staring at the different items in the collection, I was kind of able to figure out, like, the dredge roller. They had multiple examples of it just there, and I was like, that looks exactly like that. And I'm glad I brought the scale with me, so I was able to kind of compare the two, and it just looked too similar. So luckily, I have multiple examples of these oyster vessels that I can actually look at. They had an actual bug eye, which is the Edna, and I referenced that. And actually being able to go inside the hull is it was pretty awesome to see the centerboard, the stem to stern, where all the frames were, and it looks very similar to the wreck we have, though there's quite a few different variations. But yeah, it was a great experience.
So would you say that? I'm
Oh,
sorry, Nathan. Go ahead. Would you say that what we're looking at in the tar or the Pamlico is a bug eye, or do you think it's some sort of like hybrid? Is it a Sharpie? I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about what you think based on the information that you've recovered?
At the moment, I don't know, it's all theory, but the lines, the frame stations, the stem to stern, the centerboard, it all looks like it's some vessel that looks similar to a bug eye, whether that's a early variation of a bug eye or a North Carolina adaptation of it. I don't know yet. I do know that the Oyster canning facility was directly next to the shipyard in Washington. And that got me thinking, like, maybe this was a bug eye and maybe there's North Carolina additions to it. But yeah, at the moment, I'm not certain.
Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about did you find a mast step on this vessel of some kind?
Yeah, not only did we find a potential mast step, we actually found the bottom portion of a mast. And we searched for days for an aft mast step and we just could not find it. And actually being inside one of the bug eyes at the Chesapeake Bay, like we were looking exactly where it should be. And I found one example while at that museum of a single masted bug eye. They're pretty rare. And I think they were an earlier variation of the type. So maybe, you know, it's a single masted vessel. I just don't know yet. But yeah, so we found a forward mast step and the bottom portion of a mast. And that was pretty awesome.
So I just wanted to ask Jim, because we have a vessel in the Pamlico vessel that had a saddle step, which wasn't used. So the step wouldn't be in the actual keelson. It would be on a separate block of wood, which straddled the keelson. So maybe, Jim, can you explain a little bit about that? Have you found any others in South Carolina that might be similar to that? Because you might not see that in the archaeological record, if that is the case.
I was just thinking if he saw that example, the bug eye there in Chesapeake, so the mast steps were, both of those masts went to the keelson, or did maybe the aft mast sit up on a deck or something, or did it actually go down to the keel? So maybe that would explain maybe not having that aft keelson. The Pimlico wreck, like I said, a saddle, so it went over athwart the keelson was that Pimlico one. And I don't know if the Mepkin wreck had a saddle as well.
The Mepkin had a saddle one as well.
Yeah. So that was sort of, and I guess, I don't know if it was adjustable, perhaps was why it was saddled or not, but it was, you could probably move it if you wanted to for whatever reason.
Yeah. If you had to load your cargo differently and weight the boat, or, you could actually take the mast down pretty easily to go into, areas. So.
But yeah, I don't know of any other sort of more of a commercial fishing type vessel in South Carolina. Like for the Oysterins in South Carolina, just they seemed to rely on low tide and go out there and collect the oysters and then put them on barges. So there was a different type of sort of collection activity in South Carolina. With, we got 6 to 8 foot tides, which exposes those large fields at times. And so they just go out there and collect and then put them in a scow or something. And then some of them would have sails. And we had one particular unique type in South Carolina, which was very flat and had a single sail, but it was nothing like, like Chesapeake or that one you're looking at, a little more of a, like a sloop or something like that. But yeah, I don't know of any other examples, Lynn, of those saddle type mast steps.
Jim, did you have a follow-up question for Patrick too about newspapers?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you've done any research there at the local newspapers to see if any clues as to that wreck there in Little Washington there.
I've just preliminary gone through the newspapers that the Brown Library in Little Washington has on in like digital format because they're actually closed at the moment.
Right.
I found quite a few pieces on the shipyard and the canning facility, but nothing specifically on a shipwreck within Washington.
Josh.
So I was curious if you had any intentions or thoughts about modeling the site plan that you had. I know you talked about the visibility being pretty bad, so you couldn't include images. That makes photogrammetry not really an option. And we were talking about how 3D imaging and stuff can improve like public outreach and such. I didn't know if that or if that even helps your research at all, towards what you're going into.
Yeah, originally I wanted to use like a goniometer and get all the frame stations and possibly get like some kind of 3D reconstruction going on. But just the way the wreck is underneath like 2 feet of mud and the frame stations are pretty much entirely buried, it'd be very difficult to do. But yeah, I actually really wanted to do that at first, but now I don't think it's likely.
Another question I have for you, Patrick, is Dr. Rogers had done some work at Castle Island, and there was theorized, I think, a terrapin smack, a single-masted, relatively flat-bottomed vessel. Is that a potential comparative site for your site? And I think he also theorized that some of the barge-like vessels were used for carrying oyster shell.
So I remember looking at the terrapin smack at first because I think that's a North Carolina vessel, and I automatically thought it would be one. But the flat bottom vessels typically just have that really hard chine, and our vessel doesn't really have that. It's pretty smooth and round bottom, but also it's buried in like 2 feet of mud, so it's pretty difficult to tell exactly how the bottom is put together, but we're fairly certain because of the frames that it's pretty rounded.
I'm running low on questions, so I have to dip into the thesis defense questions for Joshua Vestal, which I'm going to steal from Dr. Oakley. So he might have answered this one before. Dr. Oakley asked you this. I'll give him credit. Why preserve a battleship? Why not something else? Why are people so interested in the USS North Carolina?
I thought about this and he kind of caught me off guard with it, and even still, I've been thinking about it a while. But I guess you obviously have it's the namesake of the state. So World War II was obviously an event that impacted everyone globally. So if you're able to latch on to something that makes your home state or something like that much more important, I think that's kind of one reason to it. Because capital ships, battleships from the age of cannon onward were kind of the main kind of symbol of like national pride in the Navy, especially. That kind of continued, even though as you get into World War II, aircraft carriers really become more important. Battleships, I think, still hung on to that symbolic, importance. And so people kind of hold on to that and want to keep that around. But yeah, that's kind of. You're muted still, by the way.
Another question related to that, and this is really one that you probably is out of left field here.
Right.
What do you know about the USS Vestal?
Yeah, I talked about that in my research. That was a really cool. So it was a repair ship that was actually moored right next to the USS Arizona during Pearl Harbor. Ended up getting fixed up and served in the Pacific. I think at the time it was stationed in Tongatabu, which was like a forward base. And when the North Carolina was struck by a torpedo, it after staying in formation, it sailed there that night, and the repair ship Vestal worked on basically fixing it up so that it could sail back to Pearl Harbor for more full repairs. So that was kind of cool though, that I found a ship that had my last name that worked on a ship that I was researching. So that's my personal tie-in, and instead of my grad research being a project that I worked on, like Mr. Spirek, that was pretty neat. I thought when you were able to tie your research back in.
So no family connection then.
As far as I looked into it a little bit, but couldn't find. I'd have to dig into like genealogy and stuff a lot more, but I think we have distant family out west that makes watches, so maybe he's tied in with them. But I don't know.
There are two more questions for Josh. I'll ask Chelsea to ask hers, and then Jeremy to ask his.
All right, so I just wanted to follow up. You're talking about the symbolic importance, and you know, if that gets people interested in history, if that gets people interested in this particular facet, is there a way to use that outreach tool as a way to expand into maybe more diverse narratives around World War II or things like that?
I definitely think so. I think you have to use that popularity, I guess is what I would call it, to bring people in. And then it comes down to kind of like museum curators and the people in charge of like managing it on what other kind of exhibits and stuff they could set up within that to bring notice to other like stories within the overarching themes of the Battleship North Carolina, whether that's individual people that served on it or other stories that it connects to. But I think using, you know, the symbolism of that and its popularity to draw people in allows you to expand into other topics for sure.
So, Josh, you had quite the task in making a complete 3D reconstruction of Battleship that's pretty intricate.
Yeah.
So what did you find particularly challenging about that, and what to your recollection, what component of the ship took the longest for you?
Overall, it was definitely the hull, because it's got such a unique hull. So I don't know, the North Carolina has it's called a twin skeg. So at the stern of the vessel, instead of just kind of being a flat rounded that kind of tapers up, it's got two almost like rudder-like vertical beams, I guess, that come out of it that the rudder's then attached to. And so when I was tracing out the hull lines of that and trying to mirror may cause all sorts of issues. Another issue that I kind of ran into is that in the center of the vessel, I didn't have as many cross sections to insert in to create the frames. And so that created a little bit of inconsistencies on the whole. As you can kind of see, it's not a perfect shape along the top of it. But yeah, that was definitely the hardest part. And then the getting kind of the deck plans to line up with actually the hull. It's definitely not perfect on the inside. So, and that's whether that's due to scanning issues or personal error. It's kind of a combination of all that. So that was definitely the toughest. It was fun building that. It took a lot of work, but it was pretty neat to see it all come together.
Yeah, you did a great job on that. You did a great job on that, Josh. It looks like we've got the next session people showing up. So we've run a full hour. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. I'm sure that there's opportunities to ask other people in this session questions later. So thank you. We're going to finish this up, take a 15-minute break, and then the next session, which is session 2, is about the vernacular watercraft of the Carolinas, is going to be moderated by Jeremy Borelli. Thank you again for being involved.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for being here and listening, and everyone else for talking.
I'll just add, as the editor of Tributaries, I'm happy to have any article submissions of anything that you've presented today or other projects, thesis work, or for other classes as well.